Started with our next unit. So tonight will serve as an overview for that unit, and it follows from our first unit in looking at the characteristics of life, what it means to be living as opposed to non-living. So we're going to focus on that really basic part of all living things, and that's the cell. And we're going to look specifically at the structure and the function of cells initially, so we can ask the question, how do characteristics of cells, their shape, their size, their molecular structure, what structures they have or do not have, or in what abundance, all of the questions we can ask about structure and how that relates to what a cell does in the natural environment or in the body of the organism in which we find it. So we're going to look in detail at those questions as they relate to how cells are put together and how they actually carry out some function. Just a reminder from our first unit also of the importance in science of maintaining that sense of awe, that sense of wonder, that sense of curiosity, being able to ask questions. And also, as captured here in this second quote, I think very nicely, that it is as much or more about what we don't know as it is about what we know. So while we can understand and learn a great deal about the cell and its parts as presented in a traditional biology text, there are so many questions that we might ask beyond the basics. And being able to get to the point where we're at that boundary between what we know and understand and what we're still seeking to know and understand will be part of our focus. So we have questions to look at tonight to set the stage for that sort of asking of questions, that sort of inquiry. These are various images of cells. As you can see, they come in a variety of shapes and sizes. And those shapes and sizes often tell us something of what the cell actually does in the body or in the environment in which it's found. Some of these are quite lovely. And don't get too enamored with the colors. Most of the colors are false colors or stains. The colors of cells in nature are probably much more plain, but there's still sort of a beauty and an intricacy that come out in these images, many of which are taken by a special kind of microscope that we'll examine and compare to the microscopes we'll use in lab. So you can see some familiar cells here, the egg and sperm, maybe some that aren't so familiar. I'm not going to identify these for now, maybe just let you wonder a little bit at what their structure or how their function relates to their structure or what it is they may do. And we'll come back to many of these images and compare them to the cells that we observe in lab and that we study in our text. Some of the things we already know that the cell is the basic unit of life, that if you had to find the smallest part of your body that still carries out all the functions that we say make you alive as opposed to non-living, that the cell would be that smallest part. And so the cell, we say, is the basic unit of life. We know that you can't get cells unless you start with cells. But all cells come from cells that are already here. Maybe there's one really key question that comes to mind when you hear that, and we will discuss that some. Of course, that question is, where did the first cell come from if all cells come from other cells? Exactly. Yeah, and there is a great deal of research being done in that area. We know that cells are made up of smaller structure. We call those organelles. And those organelles have functions that allow the cell to do what it does. And we know that many organisms are comprised of single cells. So when we characterize the variety of life with which we will become more familiar this semester, we did look at single-celled organisms, like bacteria. We call those unicellular organisms. Uni, of course, meaning one, like a unicycle. So unicellular organisms that do just fine. In fact, they thrive in many ways more abundantly and more creatively than you and I ever could with our multiple-celled bodies, as wonderful as they are too. So those are some things we know that we're carrying into the unit. And I wanted to share some of the questions that we'll come up against. Now, many of you asked these questions in our first night together. You formulated questions, you remember, about the world and anything happening within it, and especially as it pertains to life. And so some of those questions that you asked are reflected here, And there's some additional questions I've added on my own because I know where this unit will take us, and some of the questions we'll be able to address together. But these are fabulous questions that I think really push us to understand what understanding cells might gain for us, to get us to that boundary between what is known and what is unknown. So to highlight a few, if all the cells in the body are derived from one cell, how do they end up so different from one another? Right? You think of the variety of cells in your body, and yet they're all derived from a single fertilized egg. Right? So what went on with that initial cell? What was within that cell that allowed for the rich variety of cells that we see in our bodies and in the bodies of other living things now? This is the question we already hit on, where the first cell come from. And why do some cells become cancerous? Is the difference between cancers a result of the difference between the cell types in which the tumor first begins to grow? A lot of questions about cancer in our opening night. And of course, all of us have probably been impacted or know someone who's been impacted by the disease. And that is essentially a cellular disease at its most fundamental level. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll begin to examine cancer and what we know and don't know about the disease as we move forward. So if a cell from a human body is removed, can it survive? Can it develop into a new human? Is this what cloning is? What does it mean when a person's body rejects an organ? And why can people only receive certain blood types when receiving a transfusion? So a lot of questions from you that were sort of rooted in our medical experiences, our experiences with our own health, our own frailty, right? Finally here on this slide, why do some cell types grow and heal easily like skin? You can cut your skin and it will heal in a matter of days or maybe a week, but injury to other cell types or other tissue types, other organs, like the brain or spinal cord, don't heal as readily. Is that a cellular question? Is that a question that we might address if we look at the nature of cells? Some other guiding questions here. Why are some living organisms made up of only one cell? And an organism is made of many cells. How do the cells work together? How is it that the cells in one part of your body communicate or work with cells in another part of your body? That's a great question, and it's one that we'll be able to look at a little bit in our study of the cell. Here's an overview very quickly of where we're going, and just a reminder, all of these are available for you on Google Classroom. The resources that I will have available in class and will share with you in lecture and in discussion are always going to be available in that form. And we're going to try to do as many lab experiences as we can. We'll learn about using a microscope. We're going to observe actual cells, some of which will come from your own body. Sounds a little creepy, but that's a very doable thing. And we're going to have a guest speaker towards the end of this first unit on the cell that's going to talk to us about cancer research and treatment, because there were so many questions from you about that topic. The basic representation of a cell in your text or in other handouts might look something like this, sort of a typical plant cell, typical animal cell. We're going to talk about all of the parts of the cell and how they work together to allow the cell to function. But we have to also ask, when we look at models like this, in this case a very nicely drawn diagram, when we look at a model like that, to what extent does it help us really understand what real cells are like and how they function? I got a little southern draw there for a second, I know. But the other idea is that we have to ask how a model, whether it be a diagram or a physical model or even an idea in our minds, how it can work against us sometimes in truly understanding the nature of something. So we're going to try to understand cells as deeply as possible in this unit, but we're also going to be asking the question of whether the representations, the diagrams, the drawings, even what we see under a microscope, how much of those experiences and those models help us to truly understand the cell, and how many need to be modified perhaps if we're going to deepen our understanding and move further towards understanding how cells work. So we're looking forward to this unit. We're going to get started very shortly with our first formal lecture on the basic structures of the cell and how they're organized in preparation for our lab.